Hey everybody, my name's Alex. I am going to be talking a little bit about some hardware hacking stuff that I learned recently. When I say recently, I mean like last week. So yeah. So the backstory to all of this. First, before I continue, can everybody hear me in the back and can everybody see the slides? Okay, awesome. It's 4x3 and stuff, so the square is a little small, but whatever. So anyway, I'm a bit of a green geek. As much as possible, I like to buy used laptops. I like to keep stuff out of the landfill if I can. It still worked perfectly fine for running Vim and stuff like that. So, yeah, editor wartime. So I bought a ThinkPad recently. My first ThinkPad ever. Got it home. Realized it needed a password to get into the BIOS. So that was a bit disappointing. I could still boot from the disk. I could boot into Windows, which the guy gave it to me with. I could get into. I could boot from CDs and stuff, so I could install Linux or whatever. So it was okay. I contacted the seller, and he, of course, didn't know the password, didn't know that there was a password. So I do a little Googling, find a page that says if you remove the coin cell battery, like you'd find on a desktop motherboard or whatever, that would reset the password. So I tried that, and then when I rebooted, the date and time were unset. So every time you booted, it wanted to go into the BIOS to set it, but it needed the password, so now I just couldn't use the laptop at all. So now I have a brick. What am I supposed to do with that? So of course, the answer to that is hack all the things. So the guys who actually did all the work, I just kind of journaled. Ben Bergman, who presented yesterday, and Andrew Orr, who is also a presenter. So thank you guys. So I'm going to talk about what they did and what I learned in the process from that. This is a retelling of past events, so it's not meant to be a guide that you should follow necessarily, but it ended up working in the end. So whatever. If the tenses get confusing, past tense, present tense, I apologize for that. So there's a lot of stuff online about these laptops and their passwords. Lots of angry people on forums. Lots of free sketchy Windows tools. When you download them, you get malware warnings in Chrome and stuff like that. So things that I learned right away, just Googling. The password is meant to be a security feature. It's not just convenience or whatever. It's not. It's meant to be secure. The password is stored in an EEPROM, electrically erasable, programmable read-only memory. It's separate from the BIOS, separate from everything else. It's like its own little special chip. So when you lose power, it doesn't erase or anything like that. Separate from the TPM as well. And the EEPROM is paired to the motherboard. So if you swap the EEPROM with another motherboard or another laptop where you know the password, you'll get an error message like system has been tampered with or something like that. So it's fairly secure at first blush. So not too much guesswork. We have a lot of material we can read, lots of stuff we can refer to. So obviously step number one is to disassemble the laptop. Two things that helped a lot were taking pictures of each layer so you can kind of reroute the wires when you put it back together, and also pushing the screws through a little piece of paper where their kind of approximate location is. That was Ben's idea, and that was huge help. So you end up with something like this, which looks pretty sad because it's it's just the internal metal frame, and the keyboard is just hanging off the cable and stuff like that. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look for the EEPROM, which will look something like that. Once you find it, you're going to want to look for the manufacturer, which in this case is NXP, and there's a model number along the top. If you Google that, you'll find a datasheet, which you absolutely need for the next steps. Where this EEPROM is located is different for every ThinkPad, but there's tons of websites that say where it is. So the datasheet is going to tell you what the chip does. So it's going to confirm whether it's an EEPROM or not. It's going to tell you what each of the pins are for, what the voltages are that it tolerates, stuff like that. So we did find the datasheet for this. It is definitely an EEPROM. It has some interesting security features in addition to just being an EEPROM. There's a pin where if you hold it high, then you can't write to the chip anymore. There's a separate bit of memory within the chip that controls which pages are writable and stuff like that. So it has some access control, stuff like that. But the most important thing that the datasheet told us is that it's addressed and talked to using I2C. So I2C is a bus. It's a way for a bunch of devices in a system to talk to each other. It's fairly low speed compared to USB or Ethernet or whatever. So a quick rundown of how I2C works. There are masters and there are slaves. Masters generate a clock signal and slaves receive it. So masters dictate how fast the communication is. Masters initiate transfers. Slaves don't get to do that. They just have to respond when a master does initiate a transfer. And I2C gives you two primitives. You can write to a slave, or you can read from a slave, and that's it. Slaves have addresses, just like Ethernet or whatever. And masters use those addresses to say which slave they're talking to. So we know the rest of the computer talks to this chip over I2C. So ideally, so we don't have to change anything or whatever, we want to try and sniff the computer talking to that chip. So maybe we'll see the password that way. So the tool we used for that at first is a logic analyzer. It has some probes that you connect to the pins of the chip, and it will sample those pins many millions of times per second, 2 or 4 or 20 megahertz or up to like 100 megahertz or faster, depending on how expensive it is. And it'll record whether each of those samples, each of the sampled pins was a high or a low, a digital 1 or a digital 0, and it'll keep track of all of them. And then, so you can analyze that later. You basically get like this kind of square waveform. And then the software for these, they can decode a whole lot of protocols, including I2C, which is really good for us. So this is the pinout for the particular EEPROM. There's 8 pins, but we only care about 3 of them. We only have to tap 3 of them in order to get the I2C signal. So bottom right, there's SDA and SCL. That's data and clock, respectively. So the clock keeps the master and slave in sync, and then the data is, the SDA is what the actual data goes over. VSS in the bottom left is ground, so you want to have that hooked up as well. So we hook up the logic analyzer to the chip. Ground first, I guess that's important for electrical safety reasons. I don't really know how electricity works though, so. And then you hook the other 2 probes. You just pick any 2 probes and hook them up to the other 2 pins. And yeah, and then so when you go to initiate a capture, you're gonna have to pick a sample rate. The logic analyzer can do anything up to its maximum rate, which might be 100 megahertz down to like 10 kilohertz, 10,000 times per second. So the general rule of thumb is you want to capture as fast as possible. There's a whole lot of math about like sample rates, like the Nyquist-Shannon sample theorem, which I don't understand at all. So general rule of thumb is sample as fast as possible. So I2C, yeah, runs at many speeds, anywhere from 10 kilohertz to a few megahertz. So it's, yeah, best to just do the fastest as possible. So, so what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to start the capture before the laptop is turned on. And then you power it on, wait for the 10-second boot or whatever to happen, and then, or not boot, but post and stuff like that. And then eventually you'll come to that terrible password screen again. Guess a couple passwords. It's going to tell you that they're wrong because you don't know the password. If you do, why are you doing this? And then once you're done, then you stop the capture. And so at that point, you've captured everything you could possibly care about because the computer has confirmed that you have the wrong password. So if it was going to read it from the EEPROM, it has probably done it somewhere in that capture. So that was really handy. Bit different from what we did was that we used this really nice Salier logic analyzer. These are about 250 bucks. We have one of these at Skullspace. We crowdfunded it or whatever. It can do all one big capture like that. It can stream samples continually to the computer and store them for later use. So an alternative to that is a logic shrimp. So this is only 30 bucks. It's all open source hardware. The software they use, like the front end for it, is open source. It's fast enough to capture I2C because it's 20 megahertz. I2C is like 400 kilohertz or 1 megahertz, something like that. So it's fast enough. So it can't stream continually to the computer, but it does have a trigger functionality. So what you can do is when the computer turns on, the data and clock lines are going to go high and they're going to stay like that as long as the bus is idle. So in the software, in the Logic Shrimp software, you just say, as soon as the lines go low, start capturing. And so as soon as an I2C transaction starts, it will capture the whole thing. So it's definitely possible to do all this with much cheaper hardware than we used. And in fact, if all these screenshots that have waveforms like this are actually from the Logic Shrimp on a ThinkPad EEPROM. So it's definitely doable. So once you get a capture, it's going to look something like this. This is zoomed way in. There's quite a bit more, but it's hard to see what's going on if you're not zoomed in. So you get the clock line on the top, or well, the third one, I guess, and the bottom one is the data. And then you just tell it to decode. So you tell it that the clock line is the third one, and the bottom one is the data line, and you get something like that. So I'll just kind of switch back and forth so you can kind of see the difference. So it tells us basically that bytes are being read and written. It will tell us what the addresses are, that the I2C slave addresses that are being read and written from. So we saw a lot of interesting strings in this capture right away. We saw the word ThinkPad as like ASCII bytes. We saw the word T400, which is the model number of the laptop. We saw the serial number. We're like, hey, that looks like a serial number. And we looked at what was on the laptop, and sure enough, it was a serial number. So nothing was obviously a password, though. So we took, the three of us, three amigos, took the capture home to study it. And 1 week later, Andrew sends me an IRC message at some ungodly hour, like 4 o'clock in the morning, on a work night. and he's like, hey man, I figured out everything we need to know. So there's two possibilities for the password. It's either stored encrypted, in which case we're kind of screwed, or it's stored as keyboard scan code. So it's not stored as ASCII bytes, like in any way that you open in a text editor and understand. It's stored as keyboard scan codes, which are kind of like the little individual numbers that each key on the keyboard gets. It's like a, yeah. So he also figured out exactly how the chip is addressed. Like if you want to read byte number 50, how you do that. And it turns out that's kind of complicated, which I'll get to in a little bit. And so he also figured out where the password is stored in the chip, like the exact address that the password is stored at. So using that, he was able to confirm that the password was being read, but trying to decode that with the scan code tables that we found online, couldn't decode it. So it's about 16 bytes at address 0x338, hex 338. And it was being read all 16 bytes, but couldn't be decoded. So it's a very good chance that it was encrypted. So we tried the logic analyzer, tried being passive, didn't work. So that means that we have to end up being a little bit more invasive, which means we're going to try the Bus Pirate. So this is another pretty cheap piece of equipment, about 30 bucks, made by the same guys as the Logic Shrimp, dangerous prototypes, again, open source hardware. They call it the Universal Serial Interface. So if you have a serial protocol like I2C or SPI or UART or anything like that, it's a good chance it can speak it. It has a nice little like shell, not a shell, it's kind of like a little command line that you can use. You open PuTTY or your favorite terminal emulator and connect to it over a serial line. And you can like type commands and stuff like that, and it will do like things in the I2C or SPI protocol for you. So super, super handy. So we hook it up the same way that we had the logic analyzer hooked up, just the 3 pins that we care about. That's the clock, data, and ground. And then we, so topology-wise, in terms of what the bus looks like now, there's slaves and masters, right? And I2C is a multi-master bus as well as a multi-slave bus. So it's okay to have the Bus Pirate hooked up like this. It's going to act as a master, talking to the slave EEPROM. The computer also has some master in there that's talking to the EEPROM, but they're able to not step on each other. I don't know exactly how that works, but apparently it's okay to do that. So when you open up a shell, you guys might not be able to read this in the back now that I realize, but hopefully it'll be recorded okay. So when you first get a console to it, it's in high Z, high impedance mode, which means that it's not providing power to anything. It's not going to blow up your chips or anything. So you switch it into I2C mode by switching to, you hit M and pick the mode you want and pick a speed. And then, so now that we're in I2C mode, there's a couple of really cool features that the Bus Pirate has for I2C. The first one is the address scan mode. So I2C addresses are only 7 bits. There's an extended mode where they're 10 bits, but in this case, it's only 7 bits. So what it'll do is it's just going to guess all of them. It's kind of like a port scan. You know, you just open the ports and see which ones respond. So it can do that, and I2C supports that, I guess. So you just use the macro 1 and put it in parentheses, which means to run that macro. And then you're going to want to compare these addresses to the data sheet, because if they're wrong, that means there might be other devices on the bus, and you don't want to mess with those because you don't know what they are. So this particular I2C, this particular EEPROM has 4 I2C addresses. So this looks like 8, but really it's just 4 because each one supports read and write. So that might be confusing, but So when you want to initiate a communication with an I2C slave, you send a full byte. Even though each slave address is only 7 bits, you send a byte. The first 7 bits of that byte are the slave address. The last bit is the that says whether you want to write to the slave or read from the slave. So some data sheets will show you the full byte that you need to send in order to write or read from a slave. Sometimes it'll just show the 7 bits. So you might see that in either. So it's really handy that the Bus Pirate shows you both. It shows you both the 0xA8 and also the 54. That's like it's shifted with 1 bit or whatever. So sorry, I'm not explaining that super well, but if you end up digging into I2C, you will definitely come across this. So before we erase the EEPROM, we want to try and make a backup of it in case we make a mistake. So we had to figure out how the full details of how to address the EEPROM. Let me check my time here. Doing okay. So like I said, there's 4 I2C addresses that this one EEPROM exposes. And each of them has 256 bytes in it. And so it's a 1 kilobyte EEPROM. Each gets 256 bytes, and each of those 256 bytes is further subdivided into 2 pages. So that is kind of confusing and bit us in the butt a couple of times. When you want to read, so this is where the terminology gets a little confusing. So I2C gives you the ability to read and write, but you're also reading and writing to a physical storage device at EEPROM. So I'm going to use the term send and receive to mean I2C, read and write, and I'm going to say read and write to mean writing and reading to the EEPROM. So when you want to read from the EEPROM, you send a single byte to whichever address you want to get the page for, and that byte is where to start within the page. And then you receive from the EEPROM the same address, but the read address versus the write address. And it will just keep sending you bytes within that page. It'll give you all the sequential bytes. If you read more than 128 bytes, though, it's going to wrap back to the beginning of, or if you read to the end of the page, it's going to wrap back to the beginning and just give you from the beginning. So we didn't initially realize that each page was like that. We didn't realize they were 128 byte pages. So we tried reading 256 bytes from each of the addresses. And so we had a doubled up copy of page 1, page 3, page 5, and page 7. And we had no copy of page 2, page 4, page 6, and page 8. So be skeptical of everything you're doing and double check everything because, as they say, measure twice, cut once. Double check the data sheet and that sort of thing. So anyway, this is the bus pirate command that you'd use to read the first page. So as I mentioned, you send a single byte, which is 0 in this case, to the first I2C address. And then you receive from that address, but in read mode, you receive 128 bytes. It gives you all of them. And then you do the same for the remaining. So that each pair of lines is for the first and second page of each address. And then you get the whole, basically get a whole backup of the, whole backup. So we end up with that, basically. That's a hex dump of the entire 1K EEPROM. You can see some of the strings we saw earlier, the ThinkPad and T400 and the serial number. I actually blanked out the serial number, so don't try to hack me with that or something. So at this point, we're ready to try and wipe. We're ready to try and wipe the password. We have the full backup. We can restore it if we need it, theoretically. So back to the EEPROM page layout. Writing is basically the same as reading. You say where you want to start. You send it a byte of where you want to start. And then you just keep sending more bytes, and it will put them in there. But, so there's the 128 byte pages, but when you're writing, that's further subdivided into 16 byte blocks. They just keep making up different terms for organizing. So the password is 16 bytes, so convenient. We can write the whole password in one write command. So, funny story, while we were figuring all this stuff out, Andrew said to me, hey man, just make sure you hang on to your backup, because I think I just accidentally overwrote something. So we, of course, pulled a copy of all the pages off, and sure enough, he had overwritten the first byte of the user string with a 0. So we were able to fix that, which was good, because apparently if you are not careful with erasing the password, you'll get like a CRC error, or a system has been tampered with error, things like that. So there is some integrity checking going on. So backup was super useful. So we have a backup. We know that the password is at hex address 0x338. So that is 784 or something like that. I didn't write, 824 in decimal. So there's 1,024 bytes. It's address 824 in decimal. So that ends up being page 7, and it's 56 bytes into that first page, or into that page 7. And that's the 4th EEPROM address. So you're just dividing the address into 128 byte chunks, and that tells you where it is. It's like modular arithmetic, I guess. So we cross our fingers, do the write command. We're writing 16 zeros to the 56th byte within that first page of that I2C address. I cut a little bit out because it's the same thing over and over again. So we did the write, crossed our fingers, made a copy of the page to make sure that we had written it correctly, and only the first 8 bytes had been written. So we were like, what happened? What did we do wrong? So double check the data sheet, double check our math. It turns out that the 16 byte password actually straddles 2 16 byte block pages. So the first 8 bytes is in one block, and the second 8 bytes is in another block. So set up a second write to, instead of 56, we instead write to 64, which is 8 bytes over, so it's in the next block. And we only write 8 bytes, and then we make a copy and double check. So those are the original bytes, the red ones, and then down in the bottom, that's the new bytes. This is vbindiff, by the way, just like a Linux ncurses program. So yeah, we were able to erase the bytes, and at this point, it was a moment of truth, time to reboot. So I have a little video. This is the original. Oh, I don't know if I can actually play that. Yeah, it's not playing for me. So anyway, basically, we reboot the computer, and it you get the little post screen, the little ThinkPad logo, and then it tells you the date and timer on set, and then the BIOS is open, and you can change things in it, reset the password and everything, and we did a bunch of high-fiving and swearing and stuff like that, so. It all ended up working out. So the password that we're actually, or I'm sorry, the computer we're using for registration is that same computer, so it totally worked. Thanks for listening. I don't think I have any time for questions. Maybe one quick question? Sure.
Did you write a password to see if you could figure out how it was encrypted?
I didn't. We thought about doing that, but I figured there's a built-in TPM, like there's a trusted platform module in the laptop which can do like proper encryption. So I assume, and this is, I'm assuming, I shouldn't assume, but I assume that the crypto is good and that we would not be able to break it. So, but maybe that's a good future project for someone to look into. Anyway, thank you.